Hi, welcome to week 1 of the Poetry Podcast. And this week we've got Mrs Jones and Miss Campbell, and we are going to be discussing Remains by Simon Armitage and War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy, with a specific focus on the impact of war.
So I think it's really important to just go over a general summary of what each poem are about in the first instance. So with Simon Armitage Remains, it is loosely based on a set of interviews created for a documentary called The Not Dead for Channel 4. And in this documentary, there are a number of interviews with soldiers and the repercussions of what they've gone through. And in Remains, one of those incidences that created or caused post-traumatic stress disorder in a particular soldier is covered. Within War Photographer, we have influences from Carol Ann Duffy's friendship with Don Cullen, who was a war photographer, and those influences you can see through references to certain examples from war and certain photographs that actually are linked to real photos. And again, it's covering and summarising ideas around the impact of war and the fact that actually we, as the public, are sometimes ignorant as to the long-term effects of it, and the fact that we kind of brush it off after we've moved the newspaper away.
Yeah, I think that's really evident in War Photographer. If you look at the final stanza, and he refers to, he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. And it's almost this casual, temporary sympathy that we have for those who experience war. But just as we'd look at a photograph and feel sympathy in that moment, we do exactly the same with the poem, because we read it and we feel sympathy, but then we almost set it aside and kind of continue with our day-to-day.
I think the tone of that is actually really interesting as well, because there's a sense of bitterness to it, in the fact that they, that anonymous pronoun, who are they, and that bitterness I think really does come through there, and you get the sense that the war photographer is at his wit's ends, because actually the purpose of his job is to make a difference and to highlight certain issues and certain conflicts around the world. And if there's no kind of long-term effect from that, is he fulfilling that purpose? Is his job actually worthwhile in the long run? And I think that connects quite nicely to the idea of remains and that long-term impact, because you've got imagery with when it says his bloody life in my bloody hands, where he's talking about the consequences of his actions. So whilst actually the consequences of the war photographer's actions aren't necessarily long-term for the general public, the Remains poetic voice has that on an individual level, and the bloody life in my bloody hands is kind of representing that guilt that he holds.
Yeah, and I think it really humanises the soldier in Remains as well, that you definitely feel like you are hearing a real voice talk you through that story in that moment. And I think it almost makes his guilt and his trauma, we almost feel more sympathy for him than maybe we do for the war photographer, where the poem we feel maybe a little bit more detached, because we've got that third person he in the poem, which I think is repeated throughout. And I think we maybe, in terms of, in both of them, you have got that question of ethics and morality and whether both of them are doing the right thing. So the soldier doesn't know, probably armed, possibly not. Has he shot an innocent individual? And then in War Photographer, if he isn't making a difference, does he then have an ethical reason to go and take pictures of people that are dying in war?
Yeah. I think the bloody life in my bloody hands is quite interesting for our year 11s in particular as well, because of the allusion to Macbeth and the idea of guilt and the blood on your hands as in that responsibility. And I think actually in a similar way, both poetic voices, both kind of characters within the actual poems themselves, they are taking responsibility on an individual level. War photographer obviously can't pass that responsibility on to the general public. So I think that illusion really helps embed that idea of guilt and the idea that it kind of follows him and he can't escape it, just like Lady Macbeth couldn't escape it with her hallucinations and seeing blood on her hands.
It almost implies as well that the soldier is to blame for those actions, that although we can recognise that he feels guilt, he's still signed up to be a soldier and he knows that, you know, potentially he will have to make that decision. And he does at the start on line 5 when he says, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind. So he recognises that he's not the only person that made that decision. But then when we go into the third stanza, when I see every round, I see broad daylight, he almost takes that on himself personally, even though he knows he's not the only one responsible for making that decision.
I think that personal responsibility, if you look at War Photographer with line 7, he has a job to do. I think that is quite interesting because it's almost like a calling. It's not necessarily just a job to him. There's an actual reason behind it, and I think he wants us to consider our own response to what essentially he sees as this calling, just like the priest in stanza 1, that's a calling to him. So that idea of responsibility is definitely a connection between the two actual individual voices.
Yeah, and I think they both as well, in terms of the impact of war, they both have a very traumatic experience. If you look at the language as well that's used, so in Remains it is much more colloquial, but even I see every round as it rips through his life, just almost that violence of it ripping through. And then in War Photographer, the idea of the spools of suffering, the half-formed ghost, the cries of the man's wife, even when he's home and he's away from that environment, it's all of that kind of background, if you like, to that image that comes back to him. So when we look at a photograph and you see that frame, you don't actually see all of that outside experience, and that's what the photographer takes with him that we don't see.
Do you think the colloquialism and the kind of conversational level of Remains makes it more personal, so you do empathise with it in a much more direct way than War Photographer?
I do, because I think I feel like he's talking to me, and I think when you watch the Not Dead Yet, the documentary, and you actually see him speaking, he speaks exactly how the poem's written. So I feel like you feel like it's a real person. And I think if you have family that have been to war and experienced war, which I have, the way that he speaks is often the way that people who've been in conflict speak. And they aren't the same when they come back. And I don't know whether we can relate more to him than we can maybe a war photographer. For a lot of us, a photographer is not someone we'd necessarily know, not someone in our kind of sphere, if you like. So maybe that's why we're a little bit more detached from that.
I think we've got to consider when they were published as well in relation to that, because with Remains being published in 2008, and the fact that this soldier is obviously affected by the Iraq War, and then we've got references in War Photographer to earlier conflicts such as Belfast and Beirut and the Cambodian conflict. I think it's almost like that detachment because of the historical distance from them.
Definitely. And I think as well for students in particular, like the spools of suffering, they probably haven't ever seen a camera where you actually have to put film in the camera and then go and get it developed. So they're used to having that immediacy of a phone that you can take a picture to document something, but also that you can edit it as well. So we're so used to in the modern world seeing things that maybe aren't a true reflection of what's occurred, whereas Carol Ann Duffy is trying to present the idea that when he takes that photograph, he's documenting a piece of history and he's documenting probably one of the most awful things he's ever seen, and maybe the modern world has almost desensitised us to those kind of images.
Yeah, I think especially when you look at lines 11 and 12, when you've got the actual allusion to some quite famous photographs with the explosions beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat, that connection to a real life photograph that actually most adults would immediately recognise, I think is quite a powerful one, isn't it? And I think it's quite interesting when you do look at the context of that photograph. You had a good bit of knowledge about that.
Yeah, so the photograph that was actually printed had been cropped. So the first picture that the photographer took had got another photographer in the image staring down at his camera whilst the children ran past him. So it was almost, it really kind of drew attention to the dubious morality of a photographer, the idea that, yes, you're taking a picture and you're documenting, but you're almost allowing that suffering to continue. The photographer did actually help the young girl who's in the image, but I just think in the poem when it talks about he sought approval without words to do what someone must, it's almost like he's justifying that idea that I've got to take this picture to document it rather than maybe step in and help.
I think it's quite interesting when you look at the power of the photograph as well, because when you have got that imagery on line 19 where he's saying 100 agonies in black and white, it's very personal to him, but then actually that personal level is kind of taken away through the fact that it is in black and white, and that kind of neutral tone to it takes away the emotional response, and I think that's part of the kind of problem that he becomes quite bitter about.
Yeah, definitely. And the fact that even though he takes, 100 photographs, the editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. So the editor has almost then got that power of which of these images do I think is best to print in my newspaper, rather than maybe documenting everything that the photographer is trying to show. It's more about actually what's going to sell my newspaper.
I think just commenting on the kind of structural aspect of both poems is also something that we need to consider. With the remains, we do have quite a irregular structure to it, which I think is quite interesting when you do compare that to the quite strict lifestyle of a soldier and the training that they go through, and the fact that almost kind of reflects his mindset and the way that actually he is now through the PTSD and the suffering that he's gone through. I think that really nicely plays into that from a structural level.
Yeah, definitely. It's almost quite erratic as well. And I think the use of the enjambment as well, when you read it, adds to that conversational tone.
Mm-hmm.
You could write this up as paragraphs as if he was just talking to you, if it wasn't a poem. And I think that's really important in that humanising of that soldier and it making it seem almost more realistic maybe than what we get in War Photographer.
We do have enjambment in War Photographer as well, in terms of that flow of the lines. But I think what's quite interesting is to actually have a look at the caesura in a variety of different examples. So we've already mentioned the line he has a job to do, and that full stop afterwards kind of creates that distance and that pause, and that almost kind of shows that it's his responsibility. He sees that as incredibly important, but then the full stop, the caesura there is that detachment that we've already mentioned. So from the punctuation kind of level of both, I think they are definitely reflecting the attitudes and the ideas of some of the key themes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on line 6 as well, where you've got Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, it's almost that full stop is like that finality. I've been there, I've done that one, so I'm just going to move on to somewhere else. Maybe indicating that if you're not in Belfast witnessing war, there's war to witness somewhere else. And I think if you then look at remains, where we know contextually that he was in the Middle East, in Iraq, but it's like on another occasion. He doesn't necessarily define, but you've got instances in the poem. So when he talks about the some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, rather than him being very specific in this is exactly where I was, this is exactly where it happened. Maybe he's trying to distance himself from that memory because it does hold so much guilt for him.
I think it's interesting, you just mentioned about the opening line of Remains, and I do think it's interesting to have a look at both opening lines, because we've got that idea of dropping them into the middle of the action, that in media res, in terms of on another occasion. That conversation, it sounds like it's already been happening and we're interrupting halfway through. So that idea of several incidences that have been so horrific that he's obviously talking about them in this interview, I think it just kind of highlights and re-emphasises the suffering and the actual conflicts that they've had to deal with. And then when you compare the opening line to War Photographer as well, in terms of in his dark room, it's like he's already done that job, and now it's the repercussions or the after effects, if you like, the aftermath of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, if we think about the title War Photographer, it's very clear what this person's job was. And then in his dark room, we're yet again telling the readers, he's a photographer, this is exactly what he's doing. Whereas in Remains, on another occasion, we get sent out. If you are from a military background or you've experienced war, you will know we get sent out has got that connotation of being sent on some kind of mission.
Yeah. I think I just want to comment on the use of sound in both poems, actually. We've mentioned about the final lines, or the final kind of imagery that remains in the sun-distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. The sibilance there, that kind of sinister nature to it, is really reflective of the kind of sinister nature of his memories and his nightmares. They're following him. And that kind of elongated sound of the S and the sibilance being repeated, I think really kind of reinforced that idea that he can't escape from it. And then you've got the actual sibilance in the schools of suffering set out in ordered rows. And that reflects again on the long-term suffering, the long-term impact, and that kind of sinister nature with that soft, sibilant sound. I just think it's a very clever way that both poets have kind of crafted their vocabulary to reflect the tone and the atmosphere.
Yeah, definitely. And I think especially in Remains, when you mentioned earlier about almost the bitterness in War Photographer, that distant sand-stunned, sand-smothered land, the soldier's almost spitting the words out. He's got that same bitterness to his experience, but he recognises very much at the end his bloody life in my bloody hands. He almost takes responsibility for that. So although he's bitter, he does acknowledge that he made that decision, albeit he doesn't know whether it's the right decision, but he does acknowledge that.
I think the monosyllabic nature of that sentence as well, sun-stunned, sand-smothered, they're like short, sharp, they're firing at you, aren't they?
Yeah.
And that kind of reinforces that bitterness that you just commented on. Right, so we've discussed quite a number of different ideas here from a language, linguistic level and a structural level, and I think it's just really important to kind of round off the lasting impression that we get from both poems in regards to the impact of war. What would you say, or which poem would you say has the greater impact?
I think for me, and probably for most people, I would say Remains has more of an impact, because you feel for the voice, you feel that this is you know that it's the voice. Although Simon Armitage has never been to war himself, I feel like he captures exactly how a soldier feels, a soldier that's experienced the trauma of war. And I think it's a real honest depiction as well when he says the drink and drugs won't flush him out. That's the reality for a lot of soldiers, that they're not helped by the military when they get out. And I think that actually almost that harsh reality makes us more sympathetic towards the soldier. And actually maybe for some people who don't know much about the military, almost gives them that information as well, what life is like for a soldier.
I do think, though, there's something to be said for the fact that the war photographer in the final few lines is getting back on an airplane and he's going somewhere else. And whilst we don't know where that somewhere else is, I do think that kind of leaves that lasting impression that there were numerous conflicts. His job as a war photographer never ends. And I think that those kind of final few lines are quite solemn and leaves that sombre tone and that sombre message that even though he doesn't think the public are reacting in a way that he wants them to, he's not going to give up. And I do think that that's an interesting idea to kind of end on there.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you for listening, Year 11. We will be sending a Microsoft Forms quiz that links to some of the content that myself and Miss Campbell have talked about in this podcast. We hope you found it useful and we look forward to seeing your responses. Bye!
Bye!